Well, I think, it's time really in the discussion to talk politics. And the biggest challenge, or I would even say the biggest sin that the transnational NGO is committing right now is the decontextualization of conflict. And I'll give you an example of that from Save the Children. Some of you may have seen a Save the Children short film. It's like an appeal called Censored. In this film, I'll describe it to you. It opens inside an apartment where a woman who's wearing a headscarf is getting two kids, a boy and a girl, ready for school. Then it cuts to the boy and the girl going downstairs and starting to walk to school when suddenly there's a bombing. And they show the little girl and the boy being afraid. The little girl gets injured. There's a cut to her in the hospital. And eventually, there's the Save the Children appeal. Now, the problem with an appeal like this is that it doesn't say who's doing the bombing. And the consequence of that is that if you're a white Westerner who's watching this appeal, you can safely assume that it's not your government that's doing the bombing. And the consequence of that is that a donation to Save the Children then functions as a means of self-absolution. I've done my bit. I've saved those children. Okay? So don't hold me responsible for the 150,000 people, for instance, that the United States has killed in Afghanistan. Don't hold me responsible for all the deaths of children in Iraq. Don't hold me responsible for any of that. And this is probably a film about Syria, where Muslims are killing Muslims and everybody's Muslim, and there's, our government is not involved. So this is a key issue, and I say this as someone who was born and raised in an environment and in a country that is an aid recipient, not an aid giver. So I'm giving you the perspective of someone who sees the work of Save the Children and other transnational NGOs on the receiving side. And I can tell you with confidence that it is never perceived as apolitical. And so the problem is that you're insisting on maintaining this myth of the fact that you're apolitical when none of the people who receive that help believe it to be that way. And the consequence is a huge disjunct between your intentions with humanitarian work, which are good intentions, and your ability to actually impact the lives of the people, of the children that exist and are trying to survive within these conflicts. You're an organization that grew out of the Second World War primarily, but you're now living in a world with very different conflicts, and you're applying the same framework on these conflicts. And, the plain truth is it's not working. It's not working on a host of different examples that, I can give one. One huge and problematic example, for instance, and this is not Save the Children's fault, and I realize that Save the Children was not aware of this, but in 2011, when the United States carried out a raid against Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, the front that was used to collect the DNA that identified that compound as bin Laden's house was through a Save the Children vaccination program. Now, for the whole world, this story is 8 years old? It's, soon will be a decade old in 2 years. But in Pakistan, this is a lived problem because polio had been eradicated in this country. And since that, for 8 years, year after year, polio cases have recurred. The number of vaccinations is going down. And, even this year, from January until now, there are 300 some cases of kids with polio. Now, Save the Children did not cause this problem, but Save the Children did stay silent against a government's use of its humanitarian work as a means of an entirely political and, military agenda. That is what I'm talking about by this myth of depoliticization. You have to take the bull by the horns. You have to say the CIA cannot use Save the Children. Pakistanis, do not stop trusting vaccination programs because the damage is ongoing. It's ongoing as we speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafia. Thank you. Thank you. I think you have put your finger on the problem. But what do you think about it, Mike, Rafia?
Well, there are a number of my former colleagues in this room, and I'm really hoping they're going to weigh in when we get to the questions from the floor, because I'm sure they'll all have views on this very provocative challenge that Rafia has given us. I can't comment on the choice that Save the Children US, because I think it was a US vaccination program, made with regard to the aftermath of that situation in Pakistan that you describe. I mean, what I would say, and I'd be absolutely categorical about it, it is completely unacceptable for a government to use the cover of an aid agency for that kind of operation. I mean, that is just completely out of order. And yes, I agree, we should all be ready to stand up and say that.
Now, you said things are at a survival level, and so people don't really have, they can't advocate or they can't participate in that discourse. See, I think that is precisely the misperception that development and the whole development epistemology has created, right? Is that the subject that receives help is this lower being who doesn't have a political identity, who doesn't live in a complicated context, who doesn't have their own complex power relationships to negotiate, and who can just take that help or that chicken or the sewing machine or the toy or the book or the desk and, onwards. That's going to change their life. The problem is that, there is an admission. I mean, Amnesty is the same way. There's often an admission on the part of transnational NGOs that there are problems with these dynamics, but there are no changes in the bureaucracies of these organizations. In addition to that, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you started talking about donors. And the problem is that, you have, Save the Children, for instance, has made the sale of virtue so integral to how they raise money, so that if I do this, I'm a good person. And then there are buttons or something you can attach to your Facebook profile or, all sorts of little visible things that you can do that are supposed to reflect this virtue that you've accrued by giving money to Save the Children. And that operates on a much larger scale as well. I mean, your boards of Save the Children are full of corporate CEOs, of managers of hedge funds, of tremendously wealthy people that are investing in the same companies that are making the bombs that are bombing the children. And until that, so you have, and in terms of the space, you're absolutely right. And the reason that space is shrinking is that, and the reason why this is, in my opinion, a do or die moment for transnational humanitarian work, is that everybody knows that. So until you change and you start relying on the individual donor who can understand things in a more nuanced way than, showing these kids being killed, until you have faith in that donor and start changing your structure to essentially accommodate or even court that donor, these problems are going to, I'm afraid that they're going to destroy international humanitarianism.
So I'm not sure that you're really offering us a solution, Rafia. I think a lot of your criticism...
Oh, absolutely. I just offered a
I think
solution.
a lot of your criticism is justified. One thing I would say is I don't recognize the picture that you painted at the start of your intervention there of, if you like, the attitude of aid agencies to their aid. I just think that's a travesty, but I do think...
But I think that that's implemented
I think also, if I may, I think that I think there's a danger of imputing too important a role to transnational NGOs in the overall system. What they do is very important.
But here, we're here talking about transnational NGOs.
It's only a part. It's only a part. And I think you're placing expectations on them which are actually unrealistic and unreasonable.
I disagree completely. I'll give you an example of how this happens. Bill Gates thinks that giving everybody a chicken is going to transform their lives. It's the beginning of entrepreneurship. They are going to have eggs from those chickens, and then they'll have more chickens, and then they'll have a chicken farm. This is, Google it. Anybody who's sitting there with a phone, Google it. This is the Gates Foundation's recipe for international development and transformation. So you absolutely cannot say that these ideas of people who are subjects or who are receiving development aid as being, you would never say, oh, you know what, in the UK, if someone's poor, let's give them an iPhone, and then all their problems are going to be gone. And even though, I would argue iPhone's better than a chicken, but still,
And I feel like what Rafia is calling for is for NGOs to be creating an informed donor or an informed member of the public who doesn't just see a solution that's giving to charity to absolve themselves, but asks these kind of broader political questions.
Rafia, you mentioned the kind of donors that you think that we should be targeting. I feel like the fact that we all clapped you so hard at so many of the points you make suggests that as an organization, we would really love to be targeting those donors specifically. I imagine that there are some practical constraints that have meant that we haven't targeted those donors. Do you think that they are out there and we're simply not creating the right messaging or reaching out sufficiently? It seems from my perspective, and that this might be unfair, that perhaps the donors with money, and we do need money as an organization, may be the capitalists that we wouldn't love to be in a relationship with, but may have to be in a relationship with.
Yes, because first of all, you're already in a relationship with the capitalists, right? I was talking earlier about the fact that the chairman of the board of Save the Children USA is the CEO of Welch Foods, which is a huge corporation that sells sugar, essentially, fruit juice to children. But, the point is that the people in charge now, they have legitimate fears about how you change that, that funding structure. But there is actually plenty of emerging evidence that at least the millennial generation and Generation Z behind it is very, very interested on an individual level to have their consumer habits and their donor habits be connected to doing good in the world. Social impact investing is an emerging realm, and organizations like Save the Children have the ability to energize that sector if they take the work that they've done, the field experience that they have, and take it to people who are wanting to create companies, wanting to create different mechanisms through which money goes to NGOs like Save the Children. So, I mean, I just really feel very strongly that change can be made. But for as long as we kind of keep holding on to that, that fraying thread of we're not political, everybody can agree that children need to be saved, that kind of rhetoric. There's big gala balls in New York and in other parts of the world where everyone stands up and they talk about how many millions of children they've saved, but they don't invest in that direction, So yeah, I think that social impact investing is definitely a possible solution.
Thanks, Rafia.
I mean, I actually agree. I mean, Rafia might be surprised. I actually entirely agree. I think the problem is that transnational NGOs have become part of a sort of an industry, if you like. And I think they do have to question their role in that industry.
One of the world's worst humanitarian crises is in Yemen. A few years ago, Jeremy Corbyn tried to introduce into Parliament a motion for a moratorium on selling arms to Saudi, and that was scuppered by his own members on the grounds that some of them had arms factories in their constituencies. And it drew my attention to the fact that it's often the kind of the everyman, the man on the street, who would have to pay the price of an ethical foreign policy. And I just wondered how you can square that, how you deal with that particular problem, that it would actually cost money to stop trading with Saudi.
Rafia, I think there's a really important essence to some of the criticisms that you've made. I also think it's valid to make criticisms of capitalist charity. There's valid critiques of development. I think the question is, if you want to take those through to their conclusion, you don't need to be a do-something person. You can make those critiques and sit back, because you're not part of that game, and that's fine. I think if you want to make specific critiques, and you start potentially mixing apples and oranges, what you're suggesting is that there needs to be a solution, because you're working within the same framework. And while I sympathize with the essence of those critiques, I think Mike's right when he suggests that if you're going to be working within the framework, you need to actually have the moral responsibility to tackle some of those questions yourself. So thank you.
Thank you.
I completely agree with you in terms of nuance and having very specific critiques. Obviously, I can't sit here and give you the perfect nuanced critique for Save the Children, and that's why some of my statements are broader. But that is what every NGO says, and it's not a good enough response, because the other. And I'll tell you why, honestly, why it's not a good response, right? Because the other issue that we actually haven't talked about today, but that sort of explains or that defines the big rift between aid workers and people who receive aid is race. You're working on a framework in which, by and large, the people who are donating, the people who are making policy, the people who are developing the programs, deciding the budgets, are all white and or largely white. The board of Save the Children, I looked it up, at least the international or board, is over 60% white men. So this is a very specific thing that I'm saying you need to consider, because it's not it gets reflected in the policy. It gets reflected in what you do on the ground. It gets reflected in the programs. So, you can kind of go that route. Oh, it's not nuanced enough, and we don't do the Bill Gates, and we don't do. But I mean, the point is that we are working within this larger international development industrial complex, and the truths and frameworks of that complex and how they treat certain people as, you know, the recipients instead of the makers of policy.